Okay, Kinesiology 223, Chapter 21. This is presentation number 5 out of 5. And in this presentation, we talk a little bit about addiction to exercise. And I know I've already talked about this before in that one medical group that I worked with, where I had a few young ladies who did exercise purging, and they kind of ran themselves right into the ER. But you have a different classification, if you will, where it's not an acute case where the person runs himself into the ER having a cardiac arrhythmia because they ran on a treadmill for so long and at such a high level. The exercise binge, or I'm sorry, exercise purge after eating dessert the night before. You have a little different mindset here when we talk about actual addiction to exercise, and people get their dopamine hit, if you will, from exercise as opposed to smoking pot or drinking or living a risky lifestyle. Now, you have a psychological component to this, you have a physiological component to this, you have an emotional component to this. And I will say that, sometimes you have individuals who might be like, and I've had clients refer to themselves as this, or they're 12 steppers. They've been through a 12-step rehabilitation program for maybe alcoholism or another drug, and they make their new drug of choice exercise. And it becomes this habitual process, but it sometimes spills over into being an addiction as opposed to just being a habitual process. When they talk about exercise addiction, it's a dependence upon a regular workout routine. It's characterized by withdrawal symptoms after 24 to 36 hours of not exercising. Um, you have this process where they have a cessation of exercise, and then people get anxious. There's a little bit of irritability. We're down here. There's some guilt, muscle twitching on the physiological side. Maybe I don't feel good. I feel kind of fat. But those become a little bit more on the dysmorphia side of the house. I'll tell you, you have individuals who sought their dopamine hit from a particular type of drug of choice, and by changing their DOC to exercise, all they're doing is fulfilling hitting that dopamine button, right? But it's just in a different capacity. And sometimes what ends up happening is they're doing so to the detriment of their own bodies because they're beating their bodies up over and over and over again with the mindset that more is better, more is better, more is better. So they end up progressing themselves towards this kind of physiological tolerance, right? Where they have this ability to tolerate exercise. And then you have the psychological side of not working out, and they have symptoms as a result. Or what happens is they have a physiological tolerance to exercise because our bodies adapt as per the general adaptation syndrome. And if they don't work harder or longer, they end up not having the same psychological dopamine result, and they end up having withdrawal symptoms even though they worked out. Oh, it's a vicious cycle. And so these individuals have to either work harder or they have to work longer to get the same effect. As a professional, when you meet these individuals, they're a different animal, and you have to guide them down a path and guide them down a path of being able to understand that if you manipulate the rep and set variables, etc., basically introduce them to the concept of periodization to be able to manipulate these things so they can actually have different stressors placed on their body so they get that physiological response. They no longer end up in this tolerance phase or um, a stagnant as a result. They go through alarm, react, right? And they constantly have the over and over alarm, react, adapt, alarm, react, adapt. And so they don't suffer from the withdrawal phases, even though they're still working out. Oh, it's a vicious cycle. So when they go through withdrawal, I'll leave this up here. I'm not going to read through it per se, but you'll see individuals who have anxiety, irritability, guilt, muscle twitching, bloated feeling, nervousness, like we talked about in the previous slide. And when you program in from a healthy standpoint, you program in days off. And when you work with these individuals and you talk with them about, okay, maybe you take Sundays off or you take a Wednesday off, or you do something different on Wednesday, you do yoga instead of a Stairmaster for 2 hours. You're asking them to reframe their perspective and understanding of what a workout is. And then you're asking them to be able to reframe and kind of change their perspective on what is hard, what is a challenging workout. And you have to kind of talk them off a ledge a little bit to get them to understand that if you plan in days off, you're going to be better off big picture. Your body's going to be better off. You're also going to feel better psychologically and emotionally. But the other part of it is if you have to travel for vacation or for work and you don't get a workout in perhaps one night, you won't feel so bad. You won't feel so guilty if you take a day off because you're stuck in meetings. But it's interesting when you talk about this. They talk about how it was first introduced by Bakeland in 1970, and they were studying, they were examining the effects of exercise deprivation on sleep. He had difficulty recruiting regular exercisers, meaning people who were 5 or 6 times a week for the study, because they were unwilling to give up their exercise to do the study, even though they were offered financial rewards. So furthermore, a few of the participants who did take part in the study, exercising 3 or 4 times a week, were deprived of exercise for a month, exhibited negative symptoms such as high anxiety, tiredness, etc. And that's where this kind of came from in 1970. I just thought it was kind of interesting how they brought that older study in there, and how sometimes when you do a research study, what you're going for in terms of your hypothesis isn't what you find. You end up with a complete null hypothesis. It's really interesting sometimes when you do research work. Anyways, let's get back to this. So the positive addiction to exercise. Exercise has many positive benefits to be considered an addiction. And he reasoned, this is Glazier, reasoned that the addiction to drugs undermine the psychological and physiological functioning of a person, but exercise does not. So he categorized exercise as more of a compulsion as opposed to an addiction. And he really felt that you don't have these same deleterious effects in exercise that you do with other types of addiction. And I have to agree with him on that to a certain point, because I've seen people who were highly addicted to exercise, and it was a very much a negative environment where it took away from things like work, family, friends, and it was no longer a healthy or compulsion, if you will, a healthy outlet. It was quite literally addictive behavior that was veiled or hidden because it was under the guise of exercise. So again, you kind of have to look at this and go, okay, he is correct, but to a point, because you'll have people, let me get myself out of the way here, that will overdo exercise to the effect that it'll take away and distract from the work, family, and friends component of their lives, which is healthy within of itself. So it becomes down to like that neurotransmitter dopamine. I keep talking about, people hit that dopamine button and they just want that dopamine hit. And some people get it from exercise, that endorphin rush that we often hear about. So negative addiction to exercise. And I just mentioned 3 of these in terms of work, relationships, and school. You might have work, relationship, family, your relationships with a significant other. It's a bit of a maladjustment, right? And it kind of parallels the other addictive processes you see. And you have this kind of dose dependency, meaning how often you work out, how hard you work out, can then have an effect on just how much of a withdrawal effect you have. And when you start to read through this, it kind of hits you in terms of, well, I go work out almost every day. Am I an addict to working out? It's like, well, I get up in the morning, I walk the dogs, I go to the gym, I come back home, I work on schoolwork. It's like my life is not structured around fitness and working out, but it's a key component to my lifestyle. And it's definitely part of the tapestry of who I am, if I can just say it like that. But I don't have it where exercise takes away from home, doesn't take away from my work responsibilities. It doesn't cause any issues in terms of relationships. So, to that end, with my case, it might be more of compulsion, might be of a healthy variety. It's not an addiction per se, but you'll see individuals where it definitely has a maladaptive behavior and has one that takes away from other priorities in their lives. So, with exercise dependence and you look at exercise dependence in the context of people getting up, going to the gym, and many times they have a very structured lifestyle in terms of I got to get my macros, I need to have this in terms of my caloric requirements, etc. And it spills over into other areas of their lives. And it becomes a condition where it's almost like a dysmorphia, where you have individuals that perhaps go through or experience a particular eating disorder as a result, or if they don't work out, they start to feel like they're shrinking or getting smaller, or on the other side of the equation, oh my God, I haven't worked out, I'm gaining weight. And it becomes a dysmorphia, very much like an eating disorder. And sometimes you'll see the dysmorphia side of working out and exercise addiction tie into eating disorder behaviors of some of your clients. So with exercise addiction, just kind of take a moment, read through these. I'm not going to bury you in these, but they kind of transition into the different phases a person usually goes through as they go from recreational to an addicted exerciser. But they talk about tolerance, withdrawal symptoms, loss of control, conflict, etc. All of which these are great, in terms of time, continuance, intention. And as we look into a little bit further, they talk about how a person progresses and they go through a recreational exercise program. Then they talk about experiencing mood altering effects of exercise. Then you have problematic exercise where the person experiences multiple negative consequences from exercise. They might work out through an injury. And then you have exercise, bona fide exercise addiction itself. So what they found was this whole behavior process here, this multi-phase, behavioral process, anxiety was found to be a predictor of its behavior. So if you have somebody that you know who's particularly anxious and they suffer from anxiety related issues, they may be at risk for the development of other addictions, right? Perhaps gambling, substance abuse, as well as exercise addiction. So when a person can't work out, we talked about some of these symptoms already. And they've noted like how injured runners who were prevented from running suffered greater overall tension, anxiety, depression, confusion, anger, hostility. And just think back to when we were talking about injured athletes in the last presentations in chapter 20, where we're talking about a person in the training room and you have to talk with that person and talk them through the process of, okay, they may very well be addicted to the training for the particular sport. And now they're going through withdrawal symptoms. Not only are they going through an identity crisis, but the withdrawal symptoms of not having an outlet for the physicality of their sport. So, you look at these symptoms and it's very similar to what you see in other types of withdrawals for addictions. Now, they're great in terms of program design. What's not noted is, hey, take a moment to evaluate oneself, right? And kind of take an evaluation and get a pulse on who you are and what your behaviors are. And maybe you have things you're really drawn to, other things that you really enjoy and gravitate towards too, in terms of gambling or drinking or smoking or working out or riding bikes. Now we're getting into nicer weather outside. But it's rooted in obtaining a dopamine response, as noted earlier, and just got to be kind of self-aware to that predisposition, because some people are more predisposed than others, especially if they're on the anxiety side of the equation. And it can help to have in place like a preventative mindset, but can also help to have in place a way to have coping mechanisms to not allow something to cycle away from the person. So schedule days of rest and recovery, work out with a slower partner. If injured, stop exercising. These are things that are very much little bullet points that a person can take away to help them not become completely overwhelmed with exercise. Although I am a massive proponent of exercise and fitness, there is a point where too much is too much. So with that, guys, I'm signing off, moving on to the next chapter.